If you grew up in Dundas, you grew up to the sound of the Bertram whistle, the long, low note that came down off the Niagara Escarpment at 6:30 in the morning, marking the shifts on Hatt Street. At its peak, John Bertram and Sons employed 1,200 men and built the heaviest machine tools in the British Empire. 50-ton lathes, boring mills that could cut a circle of solid iron 60 feet across. They survived 2 world wars and armed Canada through both. Survived the Great Depression, survived an American buyout, and in 1925 bought themselves back. And then, after 120 years of building on Spencer Creek, the foundry went cold for the last time. How does the workshop of the empire simply go quiet? What happened in Dundas? Chapter 1. The Indestructible Machine. The story begins in Dundas, Ontario, a small town tucked under the Niagara Escarpment at the western tip of Lake Ontario, in a fold of land that 19th-century settlers called the Valley Town. It was built for water power. Spencer Creek tumbles down the limestone wall of the escarpment and runs through the center of town with enough force to turn mill wheels. And from the moment the first European settlers laid out the streets, Dundas was an industrial place, a flour milling town, a foundry town, a town that knew how to make things from iron and wood and stone. The man at the center of this story didn't come from Dundas. He came from Scotland. He arrived in Canada in 1852 on a ship called the Clutha, with no plans to settle in any particular place. He ended up in Dundas because of a fire in Montreal, a chance conversation on a boat to Toronto, and the kind of luck that historians later mistake for inevitability. His name was John Bertram. He was 23 years old, and in the next half-century, he and his sons would turn a small machine shop on Hatt Street into the largest builder of heavy machine tools in the British Empire. Lathes that weighed 50 tons, boring mills that could machine a circle of solid iron 60 feet across. Machines built so heavy and so well that some of them are still running today, on farms in Saskatchewan, in private shops in Ontario, in workshops that have outlived the company that built them by half a century. That's where this story is going. But it starts with a Scottish boy whose mother's family knew how to build things, and a town that needed someone who knew how to build them. Chapter 2. The Scotsman from Gartshore. John Bertram was born in Scotland in 1829. His mother's family, the Amers, were what 19th-century records call leading millwrights and engineers, which is to say that the people who taught him about machinery taught him at the kitchen table before he was old enough to apprentice anywhere. Engineering was in his blood the way some families have music in theirs. You grew up around tools. You learned what they were for by watching the adults use them. He married Elizabeth before they left Scotland. In 1852, the year the Great Western Railway opened its first section in Upper Canada, the Bertrams sailed for North America aboard a ship called the Clutha. They meant to settle in Montreal. Whole communities of Scottish immigrants had built lives there, and Bertram had skills that any growing colonial city needed. A man who knew machinery could find work in Montreal in 1852. But Montreal burned that year. Not all of it. Fires were common, almost routine, but enough of the part the Bertrams had been heading for that the city was no place to start a new life. They turned west toward Toronto, and somewhere on the boat between Montreal and Toronto, a man told John Bertram he ought to try Dundas. There was a foundry there. A man named Gartshore ran it, and Gartshore's was the kind of place that hired young men who knew machines. That was the chance conversation that set the rest of his life. He went to Dundas. He walked into Gartshore's foundry on the south side of the canal, and he stayed there for the next decade. Gartshore's was a serious place. It trained John Inglis, the man whose name would later be stamped on washing machines and refrigerators in half the kitchens of post-war Canada. It trained a generation of Canadian heavy industry's first generation of engineers. If there was a cradle of Canadian metalworking, in the years just before Confederation, Gartshore's was a contender for the title. And John Bertram learned what he needed to learn there, in the heat and the noise, with iron filings in his beard and Spencer Creek turning the water wheel just outside the wall. Then the work ran out. The Crimean War ended in 1856, and the recession that followed it crossed the Atlantic and emptied the order books of every foundry in Canada West. Bertram, now with children to feed, did what thousands of working men of his generation did when industry collapsed. He went to the land. He bought a 100-acre bush farm in Kent County, west of the lakes, and spent the better part of 5 years clearing trees with an axe and trying to coax a living out of clay soil. He wasn't a farmer. He'd never been a farmer. But he had a family, and the farm was what was available. In 1862, when the iron trade picked up again, he came back to Gartshores. He'd lost 5 years to the bush. He'd watched his contemporaries advance while he chopped wood. He came back to Dundas with the particular hunger of a man who'd been told, by economic forces he couldn't control, that his skills were not needed, and was determined that nobody would ever tell him that again. What's striking, going back through the surviving record, is the kind of man John Bertram was when he wasn't at work. He ground his own metallic reflective telescope lens, by hand, by feel, the way amateur astronomers had ground lenses for 200 years, so he could see the planets. He built what local records call the first galvanic batteries used in Ontario. He read scientific journals. He experimented. He was the kind of obsessive, self-taught polymath the 19th century produced in great numbers and the 20th century mostly stopped producing. A practical man, but a curious one. A businessman eventually, but never quite a businessman first. That curiosity was about to matter, because in 1863, a year after he came back from the bush, a man named Robert McKechnie walked up to him at Gartshores and offered him a partnership. Chapter 3. A Shop on Hatt Street. Robert McKechnie was a Glasgow man. He'd come to Canada in 1843, nearly a decade before the Bertrams, and he'd trained at Gartshores too. In 1860, he'd gone into business with a man named MacDonald, a pattern shop on Park Street in Dundas, near the old Baptist church, the kind of small operation that 2 competent machinists could run on borrowed capital and a few good contracts. A year later, the shop burned down. Fire was the constant enemy of 19th century industry. Sawdust, machine oil, wood-stoked boilers, gas lamps, every workshop was a tinderbox. McKechnie and MacDonald lost their building in 1861, and they did what every small manufacturer did after a fire. They rebuilt. The new shop went up at the southwest corner of Hatt and Ogilvie Streets, on the south bank of Spencer Creek, with a water race cut from the creek to drive the machinery. That was the corner the company would occupy for the next 100 years. MacDonald left the partnership soon after. McKechnie needed somebody who knew his way around heavy machinery, and across town at Gartshores, there was a Scotsman who'd just come back from 5 years on a bush farm with something to prove. In 1863, McKechnie and Bertram went into business together. They called the company the Canada Tool Works. Their first products were woodworking machines, planing machines, surface planers, molding machines, scroll saws and band saws, the kinds of tools that a Canadian woodworker in the lumber-rich, half-cleared country between Confederation and the railway boom would actually buy. The market was small. The competition was English and American. But Dundas had 2 things going for it: cheap water power off the escarpment and a deep talent pool of Scottish-trained machinists who'd come up through Gartshores. They grew. Slowly at first. In 1867, the year of Confederation, they built a new office building, a machine and pattern shop, and a stable. In 1871, they put up a larger machine shop along Hatt Street. By the mid-1880s, McKechnie and Bertram employed roughly 150 men. Then came the national policy. In 1879, Sir John A. Macdonald's government raised tariffs on imported manufactured goods from an average of 14% to nearly 21%. The intent was explicit: protect Canadian factories from American competition. Give domestic manufacturers a wall to grow behind. The political debate that followed the policy lasted for the next century, and the policy itself shaped almost every Canadian industrial firm founded between Confederation and the First World War. For the Canada Tool Works, the national policy was the umbrella under which an Ontario machine builder could afford to make machinery for an Ontario market. Without that tariff wall, the company that became John Bertram Sons would never have existed. With it, the company could grow. The other thing that mattered was the railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, driving its last spike at Craigellachie in the mountains of British Columbia. The railway needed locomotive parts, switching equipment, bridge components, track presses. Every railway shop in the country needed heavy machine tools, and the bigger the railway grew, the bigger the tools had to be. Bertram pivoted. Woodworking machines stayed in the catalog, but the company began making the heavy iron-cutting machinery that railway shops bought, and bought in volume. In 1886, McKechnie retired. 3 of John Bertram's sons, Alexander, Henry, and James, had been apprenticed in the shop, and McKechnie's exit meant they could come into the partnership. The name changed. From that point on, the sign over the door read, John Bertram and Sons. In 1889, John Bertram did something that, more than anything else, marked the company's transition from a regional shop to a national one. The water race off Spencer Creek had become unreliable. The escarpment watershed had been logged for 50 years, and what had been a steady, year-round flow was now a torrent in spring and a trickle in August. He installed an 80-horsepower Wheelock steam engine. The water wheel that had powered the Canada Tool Works for nearly 30 years was retired. The age of water was over. The age of steam, and of steam-built machinery for a steam-powered country, was just beginning. Chapter 4. Sons of the Empire. By the 1890s, the Bertram catalog was no longer a list of woodworking machines. It was a list of giants: lathes, planers, shapers, drills, milling machines, bolt cutters, punches and shears, slotting machines, plate-bending rolls, steam hammers, radial drills, special machine tools for the locomotive industry. The catalog ran to dozens of pages, and the photographs in it showed machines so large that the men standing beside them looked like miniatures, operators dwarfed by the equipment they ran, the way you sometimes see in photographs of ships under construction. The company's specialty was the very large machine tool, the kind nobody else in Canada built, and few firms anywhere in the British Empire built. Vertical boring mills capable of machining a workpiece 36 feet in diameter, lathes with beds long enough to turn a locomotive driving wheel of any size the railway might order, steam hammers that shook the foundations of the buildings they were installed in. In 1901, John Bertram reorganized the partnership as a limited company, John Bertram and Sons Company Limited, to comply with the new Canadian Companies Act. The shop on Hatt Street was no longer a shop. It was a works, and the works was about to be discovered by the Americans. In 1905, John Bertram and Sons merged with Niles Bement Pond. Niles Bement Pond was an American holding company, the result of a turn-of-the-century consolidation that had combined Niles Tool Works, Bement Miles and Company, the Pond Machine Tool Company, and other firms into one of the largest machine tool concerns in the United States. The merger gave the American parent a Canadian subsidiary with its own engineering tradition and its own customer base. It gave Bertram something more valuable: a sales office in London. The London office mattered. London was the capital of the empire, the place from which railway contracts, naval contracts, colonial public works contracts, and mining contracts were tendered for half the world. A Canadian machine tool company with no London presence could sell to Canadian railways and a few American shops. A Canadian machine tool company with a London office could sell to India, to Australia, to South Africa, to every shipyard from the Clyde to Hong Kong that needed a vertical boring mill for the dockyard's machine shop. The Bertram catalog billed the firm as builders of metalworking machine tools for railroad, locomotive, and car shops, machine shops, rolling mills, steam forges, shipyards, boiler and bridge works. In other words, everything industrial. Every part of the empire's industrial machinery, the empire's industrial machinery itself, ran on tools built in Dundas. Branch offices opened across Canada: Montreal, Toronto, Walkerville, near Windsor, Winnipeg. Sales representatives covered Halifax and Vancouver. The company that had started with 150 men and a water race off Spencer Creek now sold lathes through agents on 3 continents. John Bertram died in 1906, a year after the merger, at the age of 77. He'd lived long enough to see the company he built become an empire concern. He hadn't lived long enough to see what his eldest son would become. Alexander Bertram was born in 1853, 7 months after his parents reached Canada. He'd been apprenticed in the shop at 14, leading a horse and cart. He joined the Hamilton militia as a bugler at 16. When his father died, Alexander became president of John Bertram Sons. He moved his office to Montreal in 1912 to be closer to the railway head offices that were the company's biggest customers. By 1915, he was in Ottawa. The First World War made him a national figure. In the chaotic first months of the war, when Canadian munitions production was a scandal of broken contracts and corruption, the Borden government appointed Sir Sam Hughes's Shell Committee to clean up the mess. Alexander Bertram chaired it. When the Shell Committee was dissolved and replaced with the Imperial Munitions Board in 1915, Alexander Bertram became its vice chair. He was promoted to brigadier general the same year. In 1916, he was knighted by King George V for his service to the Empire's war production. While Sir Alexander Bertram ran national munitions policy from Ottawa, his brother Henry ran the works in Dundas. Henry was the practical Bertram, the one who understood what the machines actually did. Under his management, the Hatt Street complex was reorganized for shell production. Lathes that had been built for locomotive work were retooled to turn artillery shells from the 18-pounder upward. The workforce reached roughly 1,200 men by the war's end, 8 times what it had been in the McKechnie era. The water race was a memory. The buildings stretched along both sides of Hatt Street, and on every shell that left the Bertram Works for the Western Front, there was, in some sense, the signature of a Scottish-born machinist who'd come back from a bush farm in Kent County 50 years earlier, determined that nobody would ever tell him again that his skills were not needed. Chapter 5. The Roar. A man arriving for the morning shift at the Bertram Works in 1948 would have walked down Hatt Street in the dark. Winter in Dundas comes off Lake Ontario in long gray waves that turn to snow before they hit the escarpment, and a January morning at 6:30 was as black as midnight. The men coming up Hatt Street from the south end of town carried lunch pails. Their breath rose in the cold. Their boots crunched in the snow that the night shift had tracked out of the shops. Above them, the Bertram buildings ran for a quarter-mile along the south bank of Spencer Creek. The old machine shop, the new machine shop, the foundry, the erecting bay, the pattern shop, the office on Ogilvy Street. 22,600 square meters of brick and steel and corrugated iron. Every window lit, every chimney smoking. The whole complex sounding like a city before the city had woken up. You walked in through the gate. You punched the clock. The foreman nodded. You went to your station. If your station was the foundry, the first thing that hit you was the heat. Even at 6:30 in the morning, before the day's first pour, the foundry held the warmth of yesterday's iron. A deep, mineral warmth that smelled of green sand molds and burnt coal and the particular sharp tang of cooling cast iron. The cupola furnace on the south wall was already running. You could see the orange line at the top of the stack where the gases burned off. By 8 o'clock, you'd be sweating through your shirt. The molders worked in pairs. One pattern, 2 men, a wooden flask, sand packed by hand, until it was tight enough to take the shape and loose enough to vent the gas. For the small castings, pump housings, gear blanks, the bed of a 6-foot lathe, the work went fast. For the large castings, the molds were as big as rooms. A foundry mold for the bed of a 60-inch planer measured 60 inches by 60 inches by 12 feet. It took a crane to lower the core. It took half a day to pour. And when the pour came, the foundry filled with light, a white-orange light that threw the shadows of the men against the brick walls of the building, and a smell of hot iron that you could still taste 2 hours later when you came out for lunch. If your station was the machine shop, you walked past the foundry and into a building where the noise had a different texture. The foundry was hot and loud and intermittent, bursts of pouring, then the quieter work of molding. The machine shop was continuous, lathes turning, planers reciprocating, milling machines cutting, the steady industrial hum of 100 machines all working at once. The biggest of the lathes ran the length of the building. The biggest of the vertical boring mills, installed in 1926 for a customer at Canadian General Electric in Peterborough, stood 40 feet high, mounted on rails so the table could be backed away from the cutting head to accept a workpiece up to 48 feet in diameter. It turned at a maximum of 7 revolutions per minute. At full bore, the cutting head removed iron in long blue spirals that fell to the floor and lay there until the apprentice came to sweep them up. The men who ran those machines were the aristocrats of the shop. A senior lathe operator at Bertram was something between a tradesman and an artist, a man who could read a blueprint, set up a workpiece by eye and feel, calculate his own feeds and speeds, and turn a casting that had come out of the foundry the day before into a finished part that fit its mating piece to 1/1000th of an inch. The work took years to learn. The good ones stayed for life. By 1948, the works employed roughly 1,000 men, including the subsidiary Pratt and Whitney Canada, which Bertram had absorbed through the Niles-Beamont Pond connection in earlier decades. The customer list read like a directory of Canadian heavy industry. The Canadian Pacific Railway bought lathes by the dozen. Canadian General Electric in Peterborough bought boring mills for hydroelectric turbine work. Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie bought hot metal cars and rolling mill components. Stelco in Hamilton bought steam hammers and forging presses, and one of those steam hammers, built around 1939, painted in the particular shade of green the Dundas men called Bertram green, would still be in service at Stelco in the mid-1990s, half a century after it left Hatt Street. The National Research Council bought a Bertram lathe for a wind tunnel installation. The newspaper industry bought the Cameron newspaper winder, designed and built in Dundas in 1934. What Bertram built, in other words, was the equipment that built everything else. Every locomotive driving wheel turned in a Canadian railway shop in those years was probably turned on a Bertram lathe. Every large casting machine for a Canadian hydroelectric station was probably bored on a Bertram vertical boring mill. The country's industrial backbone, the railways, the steel mills, the hydroelectric stations, the shipyards, ran, at its most fundamental level, on machinery built on Hatt Street in Dundas, Ontario, by men whose grandfathers had trained at Gartshores. At lunchtime, the men came out of the shops and sat on the brick walls along Hatt Street, eating sandwiches their wives had packed before dawn, drinking coffee from thermoses, smoking. The works whistle had a particular pitch, a long, low note that you could hear all the way up the escarpment in the still air of a winter noon. It marked the shifts. It told the wives in the houses on the side streets that the morning was over and their husbands were eating. It told the Dundas children in the schools on Park Street and Ogilvy Street what time it was without having to look at a clock. Then the whistle blew again, and the men went back inside, and the roar started up again, and the work continued. Chapter 6. A Town Built on Lathes. The Bertram family lived in Dundas. They didn't live anywhere else. John Bertram had built a house called Glen Home, a stone mansion on 12 acres on Governor's Road, in 1884, and the Bertrams who came after him built within walking distance of the works they ran. Henry, then H. Graham Bertram, who became president of the company in 1926 after Sir Alexander died in Montreal that year. 3 generations of Bertrams in a town whose population never rose above 15,000, running a company whose products reached every corner of the empire. The grandfather had been a Scottish immigrant. The grandson was a Dundas businessman with a Toronto law firm and a country club membership, and a quiet pride in the family name on the side of every machine that left Hatt Street. In 1925, H. Graham Bertram and his uncles did something almost no other Canadian industrial family of their generation managed. They bought the company back. The American parent, Niles-Beamont Pond, had owned Bertram for 20 years. In 1925, with the Bertrams flush from war work and the Americans interested in liquidating Canadian holdings, the family bought back the Niles-Beamont Pond stock and made the company independent again. For a moment, a long moment, lasting through the Depression and the Second World War and into the post-war boom, the heaviest machine tool builder in the British Empire was, once again, a Canadian family firm. Owned by the Bertrams, run from Dundas, selling to the world. What the works meant to the town was almost everything. There were other employers in Dundas. Canadian Canners had a plant. Bertram Brothers. Limited, a separate company in the furniture business, employed a few hundred. The Cataract Power Company had offices, but Bertram was the company. When the works whistle blew at 6:30 in the morning, the men who walked through the gates were husbands and fathers and brothers of women working in shops on King Street and children attending classes at Dundas District High School. When a Bertram lathe was crated up and shipped from the works yard down to the rail siding for transport to a customer in Calcutta or Sydney or Glasgow, the men who'd built it watched it go with the particular pride of craftsmen who knew that the thing they just made was the best of its kind anywhere. The Second World War brought the works to its highest output. Bertram built machine tools for the armaments industry, specialized boring equipment for field guns, and the kind of heavy machinery that the Allied war economy needed in volumes nobody had imagined possible in 1939. The Hatt Street complex by 1950 covered 243,000 square feet of working space, not counting the Ogilvy Street office. The foundry could pour castings up to 60 tons. The erecting bay could assemble a vertical boring mill of any size the company had ever built. H. Graham Bertram ran the company through all of it: the Depression, the war, the post-war boom. He'd been groomed for the job from boyhood, the way the sons of 19th-century industrialists were groomed: apprenticed in the shop, sent to the right schools, brought into the offices on Ogilvy Street as a young man, and given more responsibility each year until, in the natural turning of the generations, the company was his to run. He ran it the way his grandfather would have wanted him to run it. But H. Graham Bertram had no sons. Chapter 7. The Summit. By 1950, John Bertram and Sons was at the summit of its history. 1,000 workers, including the Pratt and Whitney Canada subsidiary. 22,600 square meters of industrial floor space along Hatt Street. A customer list that included every major Canadian railway, steel mill, hydroelectric utility, and heavy engineering firm. A reputation built over 9 decades as the heaviest machine tool builder in the British Empire. A family at the helm: H. Graham Bertram, third-generation president, a man whose grandfather had ground his own telescope lens and built the first galvanic batteries used in Ontario. The works at the end of the 1940s had the confidence of a firm that had survived every crisis the 20th century had thrown at it and come through stronger. The First World War, the Depression, which the company had ridden out by switching to custom work and licensed manufacturing while smaller competitors went under. The Second World War, 3 generations of family ownership. The American interlude with Niles Beament Pond ended by the family's own decision to buy back its independence. In 1948, the company made an attempt to enter the European market. The details have not survived. What we know is that the attempt was unsuccessful, that Bertram, for all its dominance in Canada and its reach across the empire, could not find a foothold in post-war Europe against the German, British, and emerging Japanese machine tool industries that were rebuilding from the ashes of the war with American capital and American methods. It was the first sign that the empire reach the company had built before the First World War was not the same as global competitiveness. The empire was contracting. The customers who'd ordered Bertram lathes through the London office in 1912 were now ordering, when they ordered at all, from firms in Birmingham, in Dusseldorf, in Nagoya. The men on the shop floor didn't know it yet. The work was still rolling in. The foundry still poured every day. The whistle still blew at 6:30. But the country was changing around them, and the world was changing faster. The Auto Pact between Canada and the United States, which would reorganize the Canadian manufacturing economy around continental integration and away from imperial trade preferences, was still 15 years in the future. The first numerically controlled machine tool, a prototype built at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology under an Air Force contract, would be demonstrated in 1952. The Japanese machine tool industry, which would dominate the world by the 1980s, was in 1948 a collection of small workshops rebuilding from American bombing. None of those things was visible from Hatt Street. From Hatt Street, the future looked like the past, only larger. The country was growing. The railways were modernizing. The steel mills were expanding. Hydro projects on the St. Lawrence and the Columbia and the Nelson would need turbines, and the turbines would need to be machined on vertical boring mills of the kind only Bertram built in Canada. H. Graham Bertram, in his office on Ogilvy Street, could look out at the works his grandfather had built and see a company at the summit of its history. He couldn't see the cliff. Chapter 8. The View from the Office Window. The cliff was not visible in 1950 because the cliff was being built by people the men in Dundas didn't know. In the early 1950s, in a research laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a team of American engineers under Air Force contract was working on a machine tool that took its instructions not from a skilled operator turning a hand wheel, but from punched paper tape. The machine read the tape. The machine moved. The cut was identical every time. The operator's role was to load the workpiece and watch. The first numerically controlled milling machine was demonstrated in 1952. By the end of the decade, the concept had moved out of the laboratory and into the workshops of the larger American machine tool firms. By the mid-1960s, numerical control was no longer experimental. It was the direction the industry was moving, and any builder of heavy machine tools who could not offer it would sooner or later have nothing to sell. The Japanese understood this faster than anybody else. In 1958, a Japanese firm called Fujitsu Limited spun off a small electronics division to focus on the new field of factory automation. The division was renamed Fanuc. By 1972, Fanuc was selling computer numerical controls to machine tool builders across Japan. By 1982, Fanuc had captured roughly half the world market in CNC controls. By the late 1980s, 3 Japanese machine tool builders, Yamazaki Mazak, Morisiki, and Okuma, dominated the global market for high-precision turning and milling equipment. The combination was unbeatable. Japanese machines, Japanese controls, Japanese prices. In Dundas, the response to numerical control was the same response the company had always had to new technology. Study it, consider it, build what the customers actually asked for. The customers, Canadian Pacific, Canadian National, Stelco, Algoma, Canadian General Electric, were still asking for the kinds of heavy mechanical lathes and vertical boring mills that Bertram had been building for 50 years. The customers did not yet want CNC. The customers wanted what they had always wanted. And the works on Hatt Street, in the careful Canadian way, gave the customers what the customers asked for. The trouble was that the customers were dying. The Canadian railway industry began to contract in the 1950s as diesel locomotives replaced steam, and the great railway shops at Stratford and Point St. Charles and Angus shed thousands of workers. The Canadian shipbuilding industry, which had built escort vessels and corvettes for the wartime Navy, drifted toward a long post-war decline as orders moved to South Korea and Japan. The Canadian steel industry held on longer: Stelco, Dofasco, Algoma, Cisco. But each plant ran older equipment and replaced it less often. Heavy industry, which had been the foundation of the Bertram order book since the 1880s, was no longer growing in Canada. It was being managed for decline. H. Graham Bertram was 67 years old in 1950. He had no sons. His daughters had married into other businesses, other families, other cities. The third generation of Bertrams to run the works on Hatt Street had no fourth generation behind him. He could have hired a manager. Other family firms had done it. He could have brought in an outside chief executive, kept ownership in the family, watched from a board chair as a professional manager steered the company through the transition to numerical control. He didn't. The reasons have not survived in any document that's accessible today. What survived is the decision he made instead. On the 9th of May, 1951, H. Graham Bertram signed the papers that sold John Bertram and Sons Company, Limited, to Russell Industries Limited. Russell Industries was a holding company. It made things that Russell Industries had calculated would be profitable to make. It bought and sold subsidiaries the way machine tool firms bought and sold castings. For 90 years, the sign above the door on Hatt Street had said John Bertram and Sons, and underneath that name had stood 3 generations of a family that knew the difference between a vertical boring mill and a horizontal lathe and a planer. After the 9th of May, 1951, the sign still said John Bertram and Sons. But the family had gone home. Chapter 9. Selling the name. The buyers came in succession, each one further from Dundas than the last. Russell Industries held the company for 13 years. The shops kept running. The customers kept ordering. The workforce stayed steady around 1,000 men, including the Pratt and Whitney Canada subsidiary. From the shop floor, very little appeared to have changed. The lathes still rolled out of the erecting bay. The foundry still poured. The whistle still blew. The men who'd built shells for the Imperial Munitions Board were now retired, and their sons ran the machines their fathers had run. And the order books were still respectable enough that the works felt, to anyone walking down Hatt Street, like a permanent fixture of Canadian industry. In 1964, Russell Industries sold the company to Levy Industries Limited. The name on the door changed. The company became Bertram Machine and Tool Company. Levy Industries was, like Russell before it, a holding company, a Toronto-based conglomerate buying and selling industrial assets across Canada. The Bertram name was now a brand attached to a property whose owners had no particular connection to Dundas, no particular knowledge of machine tools, and no particular reason to invest in the future of a heavy industry business when lighter, faster, more profitable industries beckoned. What Levy bought was a company that was, by the mid-1960s, already falling behind. The Canadian Auto Pact had come into force in 1965, the agreement between Canada and the United States that integrated the North American automotive industry into a single market and, more broadly, signaled the direction of Canadian trade policy for the next 30 years. The protective tariff wall that had nurtured the Canadian machine tool industry since the national policy was beginning to come down. The customers were beginning to compare Bertram prices against Japanese and German prices, and the Bertram prices were beginning to look high. Inside the works, the men knew. They could see the order book thinning. They could see that custom work, special machinery built to a single customer's specification, the kind of work the company had always done well, but never done cheaply, was making up a larger share of the business than the standard catalog lines had once made up. They could see that some of the equipment they were now building was being built under licensing agreements from other companies, rather than to Bertram's own designs. The Dundas Works was becoming, slowly, a manufacturer of other people's machines, not a designer of its own. The years under Levy were the years when the company should have invested in numerical control. It didn't. There was no Bertram CNC lathe. There was no Bertram CNC boring mill. The research and development that would have been required, the electronics, the software, the controls expertise, the partnerships with controls manufacturers like Fanuc, or General Electric, or Allen Bradley, was never undertaken. The company that had been the heaviest machine tool builder in the British Empire continued to build the heaviest mechanical machine tools it had ever built, in a world that was buying lighter, faster, electronically controlled machines from Japan. On the 26th of July, 1974, Bertram Machine and Tool Company was acquired by O&K Orenstein and Koppel Canada Limited. Orenstein and Koppel was a German company. It had been founded in Berlin on the 1st of April, 1876, by two men, Benno Orenstein and Arthur Koppel, who built railway equipment for the booming European rail industry of the late 19th century. By the 1970s, it had grown into a major manufacturer of mining equipment, excavators, and heavy machinery for the global construction industry. The Dundas Works was a small acquisition for O&K, a modestly profitable Canadian subsidiary, useful as a manufacturing base for the North American market, ordinary in every respect that mattered to a Berlin headquarters managing operations on 4 continents. What the Dundas men noticed, in the years after the German acquisition, was that decisions had become harder to get. A request to invest in new equipment now had to go to Toronto, where the Canadian holding company's office sat, and from Toronto to Berlin, where the parent corporation's executives weighed Dundas against operations in South Africa, in Brazil, in Indonesia, in West Germany itself. The Canadian operation was a line item, sometimes a profitable line item, sometimes not. The decisions that had once been made by a Bertram in an office on Ogilvy Street were now made by Germans in an office on the Mariendorfer Damm in Berlin-Tempelhof, and the German executives had never seen Spencer Creek, and never seen the foundry, and never met the men who poured iron into molds the size of rooms. In 1981, O&K exited the locomotive business. The German parent was retreating to its core competencies, excavators and mining equipment, and divesting the railway, machine tool, and specialty industrial businesses it had collected over the previous century. For Bertram, in Dundas, the retreat at the parent level meant that whatever modest case might have been made for investing in CNC technology, for retooling the works, for entering the global market on competitive terms, that case was no longer being made to anyone. The parent was getting out of the kinds of businesses Bertram was in. The Canadian operation was a peripheral asset of a struggling multinational that was rationalizing its portfolio. The Auto Pact of 1965 had been one signal. The signals that followed were larger. In 1975, the Canadian dollar floated against the American, and floated upward, making Canadian-built machinery more expensive in American markets, just as American customers were also buying Japanese. The Federal Review of Foreign Investment created uncertainty for parent corporations evaluating their Canadian subsidiaries. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the international machine tool market shifted decisively to numerical control, and decisively to Asian manufacturers. The Korean machine tool industry, then the Taiwanese, joined the Japanese in undercutting Western prices. The customer base that had defined the Bertram order book for 90 years was now buying Japanese. Canadian Pacific bought Japanese lathes for its locomotive shops. Stelco bought Japanese rolling mill equipment. Algoma bought Japanese. Hydro Projects ordered Japanese vertical boring mills for turbine work. The men in the Bertram erecting bay watched the order book thin out year by year. The foundry ran less often. The whistle still blew, but fewer men came through the gate to hear it. The 40-foot vertical boring mill at Canadian General Electric in Peterborough, the giant machine Bertram had installed in 1926, the symbol of the company at its height, was eventually sold when General Electric closed the product line it had served. The product line, in the careful language of corporate restructuring, was moved offshore. That was the pattern. One customer at a time. One product line at a time. One contract not renewed. The decline was not a single catastrophic event. It was a long, slow attrition that the men on the shop floor could see arriving, but could not stop. Chapter 10. The Closing. The closure of the Bertram Works is not a date that the public record agrees on. Some sources say 1986. Other sources say only the late 1980s. The Dundas Museum's archival finding aid records the closure in 1986. The museum's public listings refer more vaguely to the late 1980s, the exact day on which the last machine left the erecting bay. The last casting was poured in the foundry, the last whistle blew on Hatt Street. That day was not, in any version of the record that survives today, recorded by anyone in a way that has reached us. Some of that is what happens when a small subsidiary of a German multinational closes a Canadian plant. There is no national news coverage. The Hamilton Spectator covers the closing. The Dundas Star covers it. Neither paper's microfilm is fully digitized. The local union files closure submissions to a labor board in Toronto, and the labor board files them away, and 40 years later, nobody has gone looking for them. The men on the floor are told. They tell their wives. They tell each other in the parking lot. And then they go home, and the parking lot empties. And the next morning, a smaller group comes back. And the morning after that, a smaller group still. Until the morning comes when the parking lot is empty for good. What we know is what the men remember. The closing happened in stages. There was a long contraction first, through the early 1980s, as the order book emptied, and the workforce was reduced shift by shift, position by position. Some of the older men were given early retirement. The younger men were laid off in groups of 20 or 30 as projects ended. The Pratt and Whitney Canada subsidiary, which had been part of the Dundas operation since the Niles-Beaumont Pond era, was reorganized separately and would survive, would, in fact, become one of Canada's most successful aerospace firms. But the Dundas connection was severed in the contractions of the 70s. By the time the final closure came, The works had already shed most of the workforce that had built it through the war and the post-war boom. The men who walked out on the final day were not the 1,000 who had been on the rolls in 1948. They were the last few hundred. Some of them had been at Bertram for 30 years. Some had been there for 40. Their fathers had been there before them. Some of them had been apprenticed in the works in the late 1940s, when the foundry was running 2 shifts and the whistle could be heard up the escarpment, and now they were watching the foundry cold and the erecting bay empty, and the work that had been the work of their lives come, slowly, to a stop. The decision had come from Germany. Not from a single executive whose name could be put to it. From a board, in Berlin, weighing assets and liabilities and quarterly results. The Canadian subsidiary was making mechanical machine tools in a world that bought computer-controlled machine tools. The Canadian subsidiary's market was contracting. The parent corporation was restructuring. The Dundas operation was small. It was peripheral. It was old. The calculation had been run. The Dundas works was on the wrong side of it. The decision arrived in Dundas the way these decisions always arrived in Branch Plant Canada. As a press release, a meeting, a handshake from the manager, a drive home in the dark. The works was wound down. The men were laid off in their final groups. The contracts that remained were completed or transferred. The big machines, the lathes and the boring mills and the planers, some of which had been in those buildings for 60 or 70 years, were sold off to surplus dealers and scrap merchants, and the occasional small shop that still needed a heavy machine and could not afford a new one. Some of the machines were broken up for scrap. Some were shipped to other countries. A few were preserved. The men went home. In 1997, 10 years or so after the works had stopped running, the buildings on Hatt Street were demolished. The brick was carted away. The foundations were broken up. The slabs that had held the vertical boring mills, slabs of concrete 2 meters thick, designed to absorb the vibration of a 40-foot machine turning a piece of solid iron, were broken up with hydraulic hammers and trucked off as fill. The Spencer Creek Bank, which had been industrial since the 1850s, was exposed to the sky for the first time in a century and a half. When the demolition was finished, what remained on Hatt Street was an empty lot, roughly 11 acres, contaminated with the residues of a century of foundry operations. Iron filings in the soil, oil and solvents in the groundwater, the kind of brownfield that 19th century industrial sites become when 19th century industries leave them behind. The lot sat. Spencer Creek ran past it. The escarpment rose above it. The town of Dundas, itself by 1997, well into the process that would lead to its amalgamation into the city of Hamilton in 2001, continued to live around the empty space where the works had stood. The most striking thing about the closing, in retrospect, is how quiet it was. A company that had built the heaviest machine tools in the British Empire, a company whose machinery had cut the parts that built the Canadian Pacific Railway, the hydroelectric stations on the St. Lawrence, the wartime shells fired on the Western Front, and at Caen. A company whose founder had been knighted, whose family had run the works for 3 generations, whose products were still in service in shops from Halifax to Vancouver to Calcutta. A company that, at its peak, employed 1 in 15 people in the town of Dundas. Closed. Without a national headline. Without a parliamentary inquiry. Without, so far as the record shows, a single quoted statement from a Canadian politician or a German executive that survives in any form that can be read today. The men knew. The town knew. The Dundas Museum knew. But Canada, on the whole, did not notice. The works that had built the giants slipped quietly out of the country's industrial life. The way the empire it had once supplied had slipped quietly out of the country's political life. Not in a single dramatic departure, but in a long series of small withdrawals that nobody quite registered until they were finished, and there was nothing left to leave. Chapter 11. What the Lathe Remembers. Walk down Hatt Street in Dundas today, and you'll find a complex of buildings called Creekside. 5 condominium buildings, low-rise, of the kind that Canadian cities build on remediated industrial land. A retirement residence, the Amica at Dundas, 82 units in the most recent expansion, taking the total to a little over 200. A medical office building at 56 Hatt Street with a Rexall pharmacy on the ground floor. A small parquet maintained by the Dundas Rotary Club. The address that once read 50 Hatt Street, the head office of John Bertram Sons Company Limited from the founding of the works until its closure, now geolocates to a residential redevelopment. The Spencer Creek bank that the works occupied for a century is landscaped. The slabs that held the boring mills are buried. The brick chimneys are gone. If you knew nothing about the place, you would walk through it without noticing that anything had ever been there other than the buildings you were looking at. A few hundred meters south, on Park Street West, the Dundas Museum and Archives sits in a low brick building that contains, among other things, about 180 photographs of the Bertram works at various points in its history. The foundry main floor, the erecting bay, men in flat caps and shirt sleeves pouring molten iron from a ladle into a green sand mold. A vertical boring mill so large it required its own building. Lathes that ran the length of a room. Outside the museum, on the lawn, sits a Bertram steam hammer. It was built in Dundas around 1939. Stelco and Hamilton bought it second-hand in 1954 and used it to forge metal until the mid-1990s. When Stelco no longer needed it, the hammer came home to Dundas and was painted in the particular shade of green the works had used for its products, a color the old men still call Bertram green. It sits on the museum lawn now, a monument to the works that built it. 55 years of pounding hot steel in a Hamilton forge, giving way to a permanent silent retirement on a lawn 3 miles from the foundry that cast its frame. Inside the museum, in a glass-walled atrium named for one of the Bertram daughters and her husband, sits an 1896 lathe. The curator bought it, by all accounts, on an online classified ads site, from a private seller who had been using it. The lathe is older than the company name above the door of the works that built it. It was made when the Bertram's father was still alive, when Queen Victoria still sat on the throne in London, when the company sold tools to the railways that had not yet built the Trans-Canada line. It is in working condition. So are a number of other Bertram lathes scattered across the country. There is one near Perth, Ontario, a 17-inch lathe from around 1890, bought from a farmer in 1994, restored to working condition by a small machine shop, and used since then to turn pieces for customers who don't know and don't care where the lathe came from. There is a larger machine, 12 feet between centers, the kind of lathe that would have been built for a railway shop or a steel mill, recovered from a farm near North Battleford, Saskatchewan. There are others, near Halifax, near Rogersville, New Brunswick, in private workshops across Ontario. The vintage machinery enthusiasts who collect them post photographs online, gleaming cast-iron beds, hand wheels worn smooth by a century of use, the diamond-pattern Bertram nameplate cast into the headstock, still readable, still painted in that particular green. The machines outlived the company. They were built to outlive the company. That was the point of building them the way the Bertrams built them. Heavy, oversized, conservative in their engineering, made of more iron than they strictly needed, designed for a working life of 70 years, or 80, or 100. The Bertrams were not building disposable goods. They were building permanence, and the permanence persists, on farms and in small shops, long after the company that built it and the foundry that cast it and the town that depended on it have all moved on into something else. The men who built those machines are nearly all gone now. The ones who started at Bertram in the late 1940s, when the works was at its summit, would be in their 90s if they were still living. The ones who were laid off in the long contractions of the 1970s and 80s have by now finished their working lives elsewhere, in other shops, in other towns, in other industries. And many have retired, and some have died. Their sons and daughters remember the works the way you remember a thing your father did before you were old enough to follow him to work. Their grandchildren may know only that there was a factory once, somewhere near the creek, that built lathes. The lathes themselves still know. The 1896 lathe in the museum atrium would, if you put a piece of steel in its chuck and engaged the lead screw, cut a thread as accurately as it cut threads in 1896. The steam hammer on the museum lawn would, if you fed it steam and dropped a hot ingot under its die, forge metal as well as it forged metal in 1954. The lathe near Perth is still turning. The lathe near North Battleford is still turning. The vertical boring mills are gone, broken up for scrap mostly, because there is no farm that needs a 40-foot boring mill and no scrap yard that could afford to keep one whole. But the lathes survived, because the lathes were small enough to survive, and because the lathes were built so well that anybody who acquired one used it rather than scrapping it. The works that built them is a condominium. The town that lived by them is part of Hamilton. The country that they supplied, the country of railway shops and steel mills and shipyards and empire trade, is no longer the country that any of them recognized, but the lathes turn. Somewhere this evening, in a shop on a farm road outside a small town in Ontario or Saskatchewan or New Brunswick, a man is making a part on a Bertram lathe that was built before his grandfather was born. The headstock hums. The chips fall. The bed, cast in Dundas in some forgotten year, takes the weight of the cut the way it always took it. The factory is gone. The whistle is gone. The roar that filled the valley for 120 years is gone. The machines remain, and the machines remember.